In this video, we're ready to start working on adverbial clauses. And if we look in our document here, okay, adverbial clauses start at clauses 168, and they go down through 189. Before we start working on these, there's one table that we need to import from our other document. Here, okay, it's table 16 in the document. We have one example of each type of adverbial clause that we permit in our system, and we provide an English example. So you should ask your MTTs to translate these, and then put brackets around the adverbial clauses. Then mark whether each one is preposed or postposed, and if they use big pro as the subject. So I've done that for English. So let's go ahead and import this table. This is the last one, adverbial clauses. All the selected tables were imported. Okay. And when we go over here, okay, importing that table did four things for us. First, it adds a feature to clauses called adverbial clause position. And we can see that by going here to clauses, adverbial clause position. In an earlier video, way back when we were working on feature adjustment rules, we added adverbial clause type. So this tells us if it's a conditional or hypothetical, counterfactual, a temporal, a reason clause. This tells us the clause type. This one, adverbial clause position, tells us the position, whether it's preposed or postposed. And here are some examples. So it adds a feature to clauses called adverbial clause position. It copies a rule from the grammar library and sets each type of adverbial clause to preposed or postposed. And we can see that coming up here. Okay, complex concept insertion rules and library rules. And the first group, common transfer rules copied from the library. So for all adverbial clause types, set preposed or postposed. And so here we have an after clause, and it's set to preposed. And that comes from the document, this document. So after clauses in English are preposed. If we go to the next one, although clauses are also preposed, because clauses are postposed. So that's what this does. And then also in here, some of these have big pro as the subject. For example, John won the game by hitting a home run. So if we go to the by clause, right here, the agent noun is marked with big pro. Copies a rule from the grammar library to insert trailing commas in preposed adverbial clauses. We can see that rule right here. Insert trailing comma. Okay, if an adverbial clause is preposed, we insert a trailing comma. And finally, adds preposed and postposed adverbial clauses to the phrase structure rule for clauses. We can see those down here. So here's preposed. I'm not really sure where we want this. Significant time, like this year. This year, before John went to the store, or this morning, before John went to the store. So I think this preposed adverbial clause would go after this one. And then the postposed adverbial clause is down here, and post-clausal modifiers. You can move these anywhere that your language needs. So that's what importing that table does for us. After we've done that, we're ready to go, and let's generate clauses 168 to clauses, how far did these go again? To clauses 189. And we want to save these. And I'll time-lapse this. Okay, it's done. Let's see how they turned out. Okay, pretty good. There's an issue here. John went to that river. John went to that river. So that's a simple theta grid adjustment rule. Let's go work on that. Okay, so go takes a source noun phrase and a destination noun phrase. The source noun phrase will be _1 with the word from, and the destination noun phrase will be _2 with the word to. Okay, generated text is identical. Let's save it. Okay, if Mary were to read that book, John would read this book. John would read this book. If Mary had read that book, John would have read this book. Okay, you may remember back when we were talking about verbs, we imported another table from that document. So we already have a section in our phrase builder rule for verb phrases that deals with adverbial clauses. Here, therefore. So we already have these conditional, hypothetical, counterfactual, but there's an issue in the main clause here. John would read this book. John would have read that book. Let's come back to that. Okay, if John eats a fish, or if Peter reads a book, Mary will be happy. Okay, so the MTT didn't want the word if here again. That's an easy one. Let's go work on that. So here we have two conditional clauses in a row. And when we have two of the same type of adverbial clause in a single sentence, then they're marked as a sequence. And you can see here, sequence is first coordinate, and here, sequence is last coordinate. So if we have two if clauses in a sequence, we want to delete the second if. So let's write a structural adjustment rule. Let's add a new group called subordinate clauses. And this will be based on add positions. Let's make this a bit more generic, not just conditional clauses, but if two okay, so let's put two subordinate clauses in here, and these are both if clauses. And let's specify these as being in a sequence. So we have a feature called sequence, first coordinate and last coordinate. So when we have that situation, we want to delete that one. Okay. Okay. Generated text is identical to document's text. Let's save it. And what else do we need to work on? Okay, Mary doesn't know. Okay, Mary doesn't know whether John ate a fish or Peter read a book. Mary doesn't know that John ate a fish or that. Okay, so when we have two of these, okay, so here's a verb that takes two, it has two object complement clauses, that John ate a fish or that Peter read a book. So when we have two of these, in English we want the complementizer to be whether. Yeah, Mary doesn't know whether John ate a fish or Peter read a book. So let's go update the theta grid adjustment rule for the verb to know. So here we see two patient clauses, and again this one is tagged as first coordinate, and this one is tagged as sequence equals last coordinate. So when know has two of these in a row, okay, we already have this structure that inserts the word that. John knew that Mary read that book. Let's write a new structure that has two of these subordinate clauses. and they both have to be patients. And this one will be the last coordinate in the sequence. This one will be the first coordinate. So when you have this construction, we want to insert the complementizer whether. And it's important that these, okay, we have two of these clauses in a row. They need to be joined with or. If they're joined with and, Mary knows that John went to the library and that Bill ate a fish. If they're joined with and, we don't want whether. If they're joined with or, actually I guess this has to be negative polarity as well. Let's set this to negative polarity. Mary doesn't know whether John ate a fish or Peter read a book. If this is affirmative, Mary knows, yeah, we only want whether when this is negative polarity. And remember, when you're building these rules, you put the more specific ones towards the back. So this one is more specific than this one. This one has just one complement clause. This one has two complement clauses. So you put your more specific ones toward the back, because when this rule is executed, the software will start with the last structure. In this case, there are only two, but still, it will start with the last one and look for this input structure. If it doesn't find it, it will then move on to this structure. Okay, so you put your more specific ones towards the back. Mary doesn't know whether John ate a fish or Peter read a book. Generated text is identical. Okay. Okay, we have two more. If Mary were to read that book, John would read this book. If Mary had read that book. So this is a counterfactual. This one is a hypothetical. And here we have issues in the main clause. So let's go work on these. Okay, let's see what we get now. Okay, if Mary were to read that book, and this were to was inserted by layer 4 adverbial clauses for hypothetical, we want, instead of will read, we want John would read. Because of this, because of the hypothetical, in the main clause we want a preverbal of would rather than will. So let's go to our phrase builder rule for verb phrases. Here's our adverbial clause layer. So this is the one inserting the were to. Were to. Layer 4, row 2. Layer 4, row 2. Were to. Let's copy this row. And let's edit this. Linguists call this an apodosis, meaning the main clause. There's a subordinate clause, and this is the main clause. You can say main clause if you want. I'm going to say apodosis. Okay? So we want there to be a hypothetical clause. So let's eliminate this. So when there's a hypothetical adverbial clause, then this verb will be, okay, let's finish this here. Okay, so now this rule will apply. Okay, this is a rule for verbs. So this rule will apply to this verb, and this verb has an adverbial clause that's hypothetical. And so when we have that situation, hypothetical apodosis, John would, so we want the stem, and here we want would. Okay. Okay, generated text is identical. If Mary were to read that book, John would read this book. And we look here, layer 4, row 3. So let's save it and go to the next one. If we generate this now, if Mary had read that book, so this is counterfactual. If Mary had read that book, John would have read this book. So we want would have. So if there's a counterfactual adverbial clause, then the matrix verb should have would have plus the perfect form of the verb. So let's go back to this phrase builder rule. Here's our counterfactual row, and we have negative counterfactual. Let's copy this row and edit it. Counterfactual, and let's put in a subordinate clause, and it will be counterfactual. And we'll remove this counterfactual. Okay, so again, this is a rule that applies to verbs. So when there's a subordinate, an adverbial counterfactual clause, then the main verb will be applied to by this rule. Okay. We want would have. Okay, plus the perfect form. If Mary had read that book, John would have read this book. Would have, counterfactual hypothesis. Generated text is identical. Okay, they're all good. Next, we're ready to start working on illocutionary forces. Before we move on to that video, I'd highly recommend going back and generating nouns 1.1 through clauses 189. And we'll compare, not save. And I'll do that after this video. If there are any issues, then we'll talk about that in the next video.